Hello, what's going on, everyone? Today we have Sam Harris joining Jordan Peterson. You can call this somewhat of a debate, argument, battle, where both parties kind of agree on everything, but just disagree on the means to getting to the particular outcomes. In this case, they talk deeply about morality, and I've realized with this particular episode, this was sort of an extension of a previous few conversations actually that they had had years ago. They had a debate series where they actually toured live to a few different venues. I think Vancouver and Dublin were two of the cities that they had participated in, if not the only two. And they have all those videos out online, which actually I'll toss in the description, so be sure to check those out. And they kind of extend on this now years later, so it was a really cool dynamic to see. But nonetheless, let's hop in.
So the first thing I want to do is clarify something. My recollection of particularly our last conversation, and it was one that I found clarified my understanding of your thought to a greater degree than our previous conversations.
Might be in those debates.
We had, probably because I listened to you more, was that, and so correct me if I get this wrong, because I want to use this as a platform to ask you some other questions. My understanding after that conversation was that you were driven to search for an objective foundation for moral claims, primarily because you had become convinced of the existence of, for lack of a better term, of evil in the world, and were looking for solid ground to stand on in your attempts to both understand and combat the most malevolent proclivities.
Yeah, exactly. In other words, Sam's a very big moral absolutist and not a moral relativist, where you can just kind of pick and choose what morality is, but instead wants to ground it in something objective outside of the individual. He just doesn't think the way to do that is through religion, but I'm sure they'll keep going at it from here.
Now, is that a reasonable conclusion? Have I got that right?
Yeah, I think my motive will be pretty familiar to you. This came largely out of the collisions I was having with people after I wrote my first two books, The End of Faith and Letter to a Christian Nation, where I was noticing disproportionately on the left, specifically, I mean, we've come full circle now to this moment, in the news cycle. But mostly in response to my criticism of Islamic extremism and, the kind of the urgency with which I was saying that the Islamic doctrines of martyrdom and jihad are sincerely believed by millions of people, and these beliefs have real consequences in the world, and they're not good ones, right? And we should talk about that honestly. What I was getting mostly from the left was, what struck me as pure masochistic delusion, but it was on its own side a very sophisticated philosophy of, postmodernist truth claims about the relativity of everything.
Okay, this can get very nuanced, so it's very important to add some context here with regards to postmodernism and what Sam's referring to. Jordan and Sam typically talk a lot about postmodernism, and it's fair to say that they're not the biggest fans, but regardless, if you're not familiar, postmodernism is a thought movement that started around the 70s, carried through the 80s, and even up until today, primarily driven by French intellectuals. And if you're familiar with Michel Foucault, Baudrillard, Derrida, these are a few of those that had pushed this movement forward. And you can say it started as much of an anti-capitalist movement, and they took a lot of threads of Marxism and socialism, where they believed that a lot of our social relations and dynamics were actually based on power. The Marxist belief was more based on the power of the rich and poor, or that dynamic, whereas the postmodernists, they tweaked it a little bit and said, no, it might not be between the rich and the poor, because they saw even the poor elevating through capitalist societies, so it didn't really hold as much weight as it once did prior in that 20th century. But that their idea was it's actually based on your identity and your social group, that those are the relations and the power dynamics. And you can see a lot of these conversations happening today, particularly in the media, where we're referring a lot to social groups, dynamics, and identities, and so forth. But what Sam, I believe, is pointing the finger at is this idea that what goes along with actually something that Jordan agrees with the postmodernists, and that they seem to have get right, is that rationalism and empiricism can't be the only answer, and that there's a vast multitude and almost infinite amount of interpretations you could have about reality. When you fall into a lot of the postmodern arguments, you also happen to fall into moral relativism, and where you can't really take yourself out and have any grounds in objectivity, because if language is your way to communicate and understand reality, and language itself can be very abstract, it's very difficult to understand if your reason, if your rationality has any roots in any objective universal values.
Which, in the minds of its adherents, left us with no solid ground to stand on ever when making claims about right and wrong and good and evil. So, the point where it became, and this is something that this is actually a scene I wrote verbatim in my third book, The Moral Landscape, which is where I laid out my argument.
A lot of plugs for his books.
I was at the Salk Institute at a conference that had been organized. It was either in 2006 or 2007, I believe. And I had said something disparaging about the Taliban in my remarks about the relationship between moral values and our growing scientific understanding of the human mind and human well-being. And I said, something that I should have been uncontroversial in that context. I'm at the Salk Institute, this preeminent scientific institution down in La Jolla, which is one of the nicest places on earth. With an auditorium filled with well-heeled people who appear to be enjoying their political freedom and their freedom of speech and freedom of everything. And I said something about we just know whatever remains to be discovered about the nature of morality and human value and human well-being, we know that the Taliban don't have it perfectly right. So if whatever the optimal way of living is, we know that the Taliban haven't found it, right? We know that forcing half the population to live in cloth bags and beating them or killing them when they try to get out is not an optimal strategy for maximizing human well-being. And then a woman academic, and she actually happened to be, or was later a scientific advisor to President Obama.
Clearly, you can see he's not the biggest fan of religion, but I will chime in here and just add more context into Sam's work and Sam's philosophy, is that he believes in this objective good. And he believes that as we become much more scientific, you can extract and understand that good through being rational, and you don't actually need religion to ground an objective good. That's why the religious has been so important, is that it stands for a value outside of the individual that the individual can work towards collectively with other people. And now that we're evolved, he says that we can actually take the values and the learnings outside of religion and actually bind ourselves to those. But Jordan's quarrel with that is that you actually need a story, maybe religious or not, but at least at a bare minimum, a story to root that morality in so that we can understand it and act it out. And as the postmodernists had figured out, there's a multitude of interpretations you can have about facts. The story is actually what carves that path through the facts, that so they become insights that you can actually move forward and act on and understand and comprehend through the human psyche. So this is where they tend to collide. But just again, to add more context to Sam, but let's hear about the story here.
Medical ethics came up to me and said, well, that's just your opinion, right? And so then this led me to realize just how far the rot had spread. That even here is someone who is a woman academic who's enjoying all the freedom of however hard won they can be found in Western society. Presumably, this is a person who would have responded to the Me Too movement and all its moral urgency with alacrity. She was still open-minded, at least in the context of talking to me, about the treatment of women and girls under the Taliban, right? And I detail our further conversation, again, verbatim, in my book, because I was so astounded by the exchange that I turned on my heels literally in mid-sentence, walked straight back to my room and wrote down exactly what the two of us had said, because I just could not believe what had happened. So the moral confusion here is that you have many well-educated people who will make very fine-grained distinctions about moral norms in the context of living in 21st century America. They'll consider words to be violence, and the misgendering of people to be a profound microaggression. Halloween costumes that culturally appropriate, et cetera, are anathema. This is how finely calibrated their moral scruples are over here, in the quad of an American university. But you ask them to consider whether, someone like Malala Yousafzai was badly treated by the Taliban, and they become tongue-tied, right? They will even say things like, "Well, who are we to criticize an ancient culture?"
So
that's an example of the moral relativism that he's arguing against.
So that motivated me to say, all right, the smartest, most well-educated people in our society have become unmoored to any vision of objective moral values.
Okay. Well, so I'm gonna pick up a couple of themes there. So one of the things that you pointed to was the incoherence manifested by this woman and like people in relationship to micro-narratives and macro-narratives. So you said that it was in your opinion, that she or the people who she might represent would be perfectly willing to be upset about some relatively minor issue that might arise on a university campus, like the wearing of inappropriate Halloween costumes, but are incoherent in relationship to making broader scale moral claims. Now, one of the claims of the postmodernists, this was put forward most particularly by, who was it now, who said that there were no meta-narratives. The postmodernism is fundamentally disallowance of the idea that any uniting meta-narratives are possible. I'll remember his name momentarily.
It could be Derrida.
Jean Baudrillard?
Or Foucault, or...
Yeah, no, it's not. He's the guy who generated simulation theory, another Frenchman.
No, Lacan? Or
no.
Baudrillard? It's a rogues gallery.
Baudrillard's.
There we go.
It's a rogues gallery.
Yeah, it's Baudrillard.
Fun fact, Jean Baudrillard's book Simulacra and Simulation is actually the book that was used, that inspired the Matrix movie series 25 years ago. So apparently the Wachowski brothers, who I believe are now the Wachowski sisters, they told everyone on the cast to actually read that book as a requisite to act in the film. So yeah, something to think about, maybe something to pick up and check out as well. Oh, that reminds me as well. There's a great book called Explaining Postmodernism, which is a great read, which actually shows you the lineage of thought, not just regarding the political thought movement of postmodernism in the 70s, but also back from Immanuel Kant and Heidegger and Nietzsche, and how all of these philosophies and thought processes had been used in the postmodern movement, and how they'd carried their ideas down. So you see it from a wider vantage point. But yeah. Great book. Something definitely to check out if you're more interested in understanding what postmodernism is and how it applies to society today.
Okay, so here's the problem with that. Well, the problem with that, in part, is that there's no united action and perception at any level without a uniting narrative. For example, if I pick up a glass to move a cup from the table to my lips, I have to organize all those extraordinarily complex actions, right, which cascade up from the molecular level through the musculature of my body. I have to organize that into something that's coherent and unified in order to bring about any action whatsoever. And what that implies is that there's a hierarchy of uniting structure. And what the postmodernists do is arbitrarily make that halt at a certain level. It's like, so you're allowed a uniting narrative or structure up to a certain level, but beyond that, you're not allowed it at all. And that's the point at which the meta-narrative emerges, and those are now forbidden. And I don't understand that, because I think that it's a distinction between a narrative and a meta-narrative it's an arbitrary distinction. And you can't attend or act without a uniting narrative. So now you seem
Again, just think back into how the postmodernists had claimed that there's an infinite amount of interpretations to reality. And this is where Jordan chimes in to say that you do need some sort of uniting narrative to understand the meaning that underlies all of these facts and all of these perspectives and perceptions we have of reality, so that we can act in accordance to what is, first of all, in the moral sense, what's most good, but also just how to live and evolve as a human properly, right? He just mentioned the using of a glass as a very simple example, because the glass has so many facts about it from a molecular level all the way up to the abstract in terms of what it means to have a glass in the world. But the uniting narrative is that we all understand there is a way for us to hold the glass, to use it, to drink water, maybe some whiskey, who knows, and act as a heuristic, so we don't have to think about all of the facts and perceptions that lay in front of us, but instead automatically know how to act, respond, and conduct ourselves in a fashion that helps our growth, you could say.
pointing to something like that. So let me walk through your argument. You pointed to the Taliban.
I'll add one other, which I think is a simpler defeater, which is that the claim is that there can be no universal values, right? Or universal truth claims with respect to right and wrong and good and evil. And yet they tacitly make the universal claim that tolerance of this ethical diversity is better than intolerance, right? So the demand is we need to find some space in our minds to tolerate the difference of opinion offered by the Taliban or Hamas or some other group of that sort. But that doesn't make any sense. That's an appeal to tolerance, one that the Taliban and Hamas don't share, right? So we're tolerating their intolerance. But it's also the tacit claim that tolerance is better. Tolerance on our own side is better.
Tolerance is the uniting narrative.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, well, you see the same thing with the postmodern insistence. This is particularly true of people like Foucault, that nothing rules but power, right? Because Foucault saw power making itself manifest everywhere. And the fundamental postmodernist claim is that there's no uniting meta-narratives, but that didn't stop the postmodernists for a second in making the claim that you could find power relations underlying every single form of human action and social interaction. So
he's calling them hypocrites.
But this uniting narrative, see, you point to it in a way that I think that points out to me a very fundamental element of agreement between the positions that you and I have taken, even though we've had so much apparent disagreement. You point to the Taliban and you say, at minimum, we can say with some degree of certainty that what the Taliban are doing is not optimal. Okay, and you said that's a claim that's so weak in a way that it should just be self-evident, right? You know what I mean by weak? It's like, Isn't that obvious? Well, I started in my investigations at a more extreme point, I would say. I looked at the camp guard in Auschwitz who enjoyed his work and thought, I don't know what good is, but at minimum, it's the opposite of whatever the hell that is. And so that was a starting point for me. And it seems
you see what they're trying to do? They're constantly trying to find a way to find this uniting narrative so we can all understand and cooperate in a way where we know this at the extreme is good, this at the extreme is bad. At least we can agree on that, and then we can work our way as to exactly how to conduct ourselves in society to get to that direction, what the logistics might be. But what they're arguing is that because of this postmodern thought process, we're having such a difficult time talking and agreeing just on the principles of what an objective good and objective bad is. But again, check out Explaining Postmodernism. It's a solid book. It can give you a firm grounding and understanding of, again, how it's applied today, where it came from, all of that good stuff there. Please like and subscribe if this has provided any value or made you think even in the slightest, and have a great one. Thank you.